The old Ford F-150 rattled over Montana backroads as storm clouds gathered on the horizon. Its faded blue paint had weathered 30 years of seasons, much like the calloused hands gripping its steering wheel. There was a time when this land promised something eternal, when a man's word and 3 generations of sweat equity meant more than papers filed in county offices. But empires aren't built on sentimentality. Rain began to fall as smoke rose from the eastern barn, not the kind that comes from controlled burns or celebratory bonfires. This was the smoke of deliberate destruction, of lines being drawn. They'd come for his water first, then his mineral rights, and now they were coming for his legacy. What they hadn't counted on was desperation making strange allies. Sometimes salvation wears expensive boots and carries secrets darker than the gathering storm. Sometimes the last stand isn't about winning, but about choosing who you'll lose with. In a valley where the mountains remember what men forget, some fires are meant to consume everything. Others are meant to forge something unbreakable. Lightning split the Montana sky, illuminating the nightmarish scene before Jack Morgan. His weathered face, lined by 58 years of hard living, contorted as he watched flames engulf the eastern corner of his barn. Rain poured down in sheets, but it wasn't enough to stop the fire that had somehow sparked despite the downpour. Dad Thomas shouted over the storm, running toward him with 2 fire extinguishers. "The horses are out. Ben's moving them to the south pasture." Jack nodded grimly, grabbing one of the extinguishers. "The equipment we need to get the tractor out now, or we lose everything." They sprinted toward the barn, the heat intensifying as they approached. Jack had faced fire before, in desert warfare during Operation Desert Storm, in the oil fields of Kuwait, but seeing flames consume the barn his grandfather had built made his stomach twist in a way no battlefield ever had. Inside, the smoke hung thick despite the partial collapse of the eastern wall. The vintage John Deere tractor, the one piece of equipment Jack couldn't afford to replace, sat dangerously close to where the flames were advancing. "It won't start," Thomas shouted, already in the driver's seat, turning the key frantically. "Get the truck," Jack commanded, his military training taking over. "We'll tow it out." Thomas sprinted through the rain to the 1992 Ford F-150 parked near the house. The truck had been Jack's constant companion for 28 years, outlasting marriages, friendships, and even parts of his own body. He'd rebuilt the engine twice, replaced the transmission once, but the frame was original American steel from an era when things were built to last. Jack attached chains to the tractor's front axle, working by instinct as the heat scorched his back. The pickup roared to life as Thomas positioned it, backing up with precision that made Jack proud despite the chaos. "Hooked up," Jack shouted, slapping the truck's tailgate. Thomas gunned the engine. The old Ford groaned, its tires spinning briefly in the mud before finding purchase. The tractor began to move, slowly at first, then gathering momentum as they pulled it free of the burning structure. They managed to save the tractor, 2 ATVs, and most of the tools before the barn's roof partially collapsed. By then, neighbors had arrived, the Hendersons from the adjacent property, old Williams from down the road, and even Sheriff Mason, who was technically off duty but had heard the call on his radio. As dawn broke, illuminating the smoldering ruins, Jack stood with a cup of lukewarm coffee, surveying the damage. The eastern third of the barn was destroyed, but the main structure remained standing, another hit to a farm already on the financial edge, but not a killing blow. "Someone cut the lock," Sheriff Mason said quietly, coming to stand beside him. He held up a twisted piece of metal. "This wasn't weather. Jack." Jack's jaw tightened. "River West." Mason shrugged, but his expression confirmed Jack's suspicion. "Can't prove anything, but their offer still stands at half what your land is worth, and that deadline's coming up." 90 days, Jack muttered. 90 days to come up with $175,000, or the bank forecloses and River West swoops in. He took a swig of coffee, grimacing at the bitter taste. "Convenient timing for a fire, isn't it?" "I'll file the report as suspicious," Mason promised. "But without evidence," Jack nodded. understanding the limits of small-town justice against corporate interests. River West Agribusiness had been systematically acquiring farmland throughout the valley for their massive water diversion project. The Morgan Farm was one of the last holdouts, positioned critically at the junction where the creek fed into the irrigation system for 3 counties. "Appreciate you coming out, Dave," Jack said, clapping his old friend on the shoulder. "Need to file a formal statement. Why don't you come into town later?" Jack agreed, though his mind was already calculating losses and repairs. The insurance wouldn't cover half of it, another consequence of trying to keep the farm afloat by cutting corners wherever possible. After Mason left, Thomas approached, his face streaked with soot and exhaustion. At 32, he carried himself with the same straight-back determination Jack recognized from the mirror, though Thomas had his mother's gentler eyes. "I've got to head back to Billings this afternoon," he said, avoiding Jack's gaze. "The firm has a major case starting Monday." The unspoken tension between them thickened. Thomas had left the farm 8 years ago to pursue law, a decision that still stung Jack despite his grudging pride in his son's accomplishments. "Go on then," Jack said, more gruffly than he intended. "I've handled worse." Thomas hesitated, then offered, "I could make some calls, look into River West permits for that dam project. There might be environmental challenges we could raise." Jack softened slightly. "That'd be helpful. Now go get some rest before your drive." As Thomas walked away, Jack turned back to the smoldering barn. First the drought cutting yields by 30%, then the equipment failures, and now this. The Morgan farm had weathered storms for 3 generations, but Jack wondered if his would be the hands that finally surrendered the land. 3 hours later, Jack was driving his mud-spattered truck into town, the bed loaded with salvaged tools that needed cleaning. The storm had passed, leaving behind that peculiar clarity to the air that made the distant Rockies seem close enough to touch. Fields of wheat stretched out on either side of the county road, golden under the summer sun despite the recent downpour. He rounded a sharp curve and immediately hit the brakes. 50 yards ahead, a black luxury SUV lay on its side in the ditch, steam rising from its hood. Fresh tracks in the muddy shoulder told the story the driver had swerved to avoid something and lost control. Jack pulled over and grabbed the first aid kit from behind his seat, a habit ingrained from his military days. As he approached, he could see a woman moving inside the vehicle, trying to push open the door that now faced skyward. "Hey there, don't move," he called out. "Is anyone else in there with you?" "No, just me," came a strained female voice. "The door's jammed." Jack assessed the situation quickly. The SUV wasn't on fire, but fluids were leaking underneath, never a good sign. The windshield was spiderwebbed, but intact. "I'm going to help you out through the window," he called, already pulling himself up onto the vehicle's side. The expensive paint job was slick with rain, and he left muddy boot prints as he climbed. The driver's window was halfway open. Jack peered inside to see a woman braced against the driver's seatbelt still fastened. She appeared to be in her mid-40s, with dark hair cut in an expensive-looking bob, wearing a light blue button-down shirt that probably cost more than his best pair of boots. "I'm Jack Morgan," he said, reaching a hand inside. "I need you to unfasten your belt, then take my hand. Can you do that?" She nodded, wincing as she moved. "I think so. The belt release is stuck." Jack pulled out his pocket knife. "I'll cut it. Hold still." The woman remained perfectly steady as he leaned in and sawed through the seatbelt. Her composure impressed him. Most people would be panicking in this situation. "Ready on 3, Jack counted down, then pulled her upward as she pushed with her legs. She came through the window smoothly, revealing good upper body strength that further suggested she wasn't a typical city visitor. Once they were both on solid ground, Jack got his first good look at her. Despite a cut on her forehead and mud splattered across her expensive-looking jeans, she carried herself with unmistakable confidence. Her eyes, an unusual shade of amber, assessed him with equal intensity. "Thank you," she said, extending her hand. "Victoria Caldwell. Most people call me Tori." "That's quite a wreck." Jack commented, glancing back at the SUV. What happened? A deer jumped out. I overcompensated. She rubbed her neck, grimacing. I thought Montana roads would be easier than Boston traffic. I was wrong. Jack almost smiled at that. Where were you headed? Oak Ridge. I'm consulting on a sustainable agriculture project. She turned to survey the damage to her vehicle and sighed. Though I may need to adjust my timeline now. Jack pulled out his phone. I'll call Dave Sheriff Mason. He can get the tow truck out here. The call was brief and unsatisfying. 3 hours minimum, Jack reported after hanging up. There's an agricultural festival in the next county. Only tow service for 50 miles is tied up with the parking situation there. Tori frowned, then reached for her own phone, only to find it shattered. Perfect, she muttered. She studied Jack for a moment, clearly calculating her options. I don't suppose you're headed into town. I could use a ride to wherever rents cars in Oak Ridge. Jack hesitated. He generally avoided entanglements with strangers, especially well-heeled outsiders who inevitably wanted something from the locals. But leaving a woman stranded on a remote road went against everything his father had taught him about being a Morgan. I'm headed to the sheriff's office, he conceded. I can drop you at the rental place, but I should warn you it's a small operation. With the festival, they might be cleaned out. Relief crossed her face. I'd appreciate that, Mr. Morgan. Just Jack, he corrected, leading her to his truck. She paused at the passenger side, eyeing the ancient vehicle with an expression Jack couldn't quite read. Not the disdain he expected, but something closer to professional interest. 92 F-150, she asked, running a hand along the faded blue paint of the hood. Jack raised an eyebrow, surprised by her accurate identification. Good eye. I notice vehicles, she said simply, climbing in. The truck's interior was meticulously maintained but unmistakably worn bench seat patched with duct tape. Dashboard cracked from years of Montana sun. The aftermarket stereo installed sometime during the Clinton administration. Jack was suddenly conscious of the mud on his boots and the lingering smell of smoke in his clothes from the fire. As they pulled onto the road, Tori broke the silence. You have soot in your hair. Were you in a fire? Jack glanced at her, reassessing. Most people wouldn't have noticed, or wouldn't have mentioned it if they did. Barn fire at my farm last night. Just got it under control this morning. I'm sorry, she said, with what sounded like genuine sympathy. Was anyone hurt? No, but I lost about a third of the structure and some equipment. Insurance. Jack's grip tightened on the steering wheel. We'll cover about half, if I'm lucky. Tori nodded, asking no further questions, but Jack had the distinct impression she was filing away every detail. They drove in silence for several minutes, the truck's engine rumbling steadily, fields giving way to scattered houses as they approached the outskirts of Oak Ridge. The town came into view, a small but proud community of about 4,000 souls. Main Street featured brick buildings dating back to the early 1900s, carefully maintained despite the economic challenges of rural America. A banner stretched across the street announced the 86th annual Oak Ridge Harvest Festival, scheduled for the following weekend. They were passing the old mill, converted now into a farm supply store, when a black SUV similar to the one Tori had crashed pulled out from a side street, cutting them off. Jack hit the brakes, swearing under his breath. Friend of yours, he asked dryly, gesturing at the vehicle now pacing alongside them. Tori's expression hardened as she looked at the SUV. Not exactly. Before Jack could respond, the SUV accelerated and swerved in front of them, forcing him to slam on the brakes. His truck skidded to a stop inches from the other vehicle's bumper. Two men emerged from the SUV, one tall and lean with a face like weathered leather, the other shorter but powerfully built. Both wore dark suits that seemed out of place in Oak Ridge. Stay in the truck, Jack said quietly, reaching under his seat where he kept a tire iron. Jack, don't, Tori began, but he was already opening his door. Problem, gentlemen, Jack called, keeping one hand on the tire iron, out of sight behind the door. The taller man smiled without warmth. No problem with you, friend. We just need a word with Miss Caldwell. She has an outstanding debt to settle. Jack noticed the slight bulge under the man's jacket, almost certainly a shoulder holster. These weren't local troublemakers. I don't know what business you think you have with my passenger, Jack said, his voice deceptively calm. But this is private property you're blocking. Either move your vehicle, or I'll have Sheriff Mason explain Montana trespassing laws to you. The shorter man stepped forward. This doesn't concern you, old man. Walk away. Old man. Jack felt a familiar heat rise in his chest, the same fire that had gotten him into bar fights in his 20s and court-martials in his 30s. At 58, he'd learned to control it better, but it still burned. I'm not much for walking these days, Jack replied, shifting his weight to his good leg, the right one, not the left with its souvenir shrapnel from Desert Storm. Now move your vehicle. The shorter man reached inside his jacket, but before he could withdraw whatever he was reaching for, Jack swung the tire iron into view, holding it with the casual confidence of someone who'd used tools as weapons before. A tense silence followed, broken by the sound of Tori's door opening. She stepped out, her posture straight and commanding despite the cut on her forehead. Mr. Delaney, she addressed the taller man, her voice cool. Still doing Anton's dirty work. I see. Tell him if he wants to discuss business. He can call my attorney like a civilized person. The man named Delaney's eyes narrowed. This isn't about business. Victoria, this is personal. Anton doesn't appreciate being humiliated. Anton's feelings are not my concern, Tori replied evenly. Now, unless you want me to file harassment charges in yet another jurisdiction, I suggest you leave. Delaney held her gaze for a long moment, then nodded almost imperceptibly to his companion. This isn't finished. It never is with Anton, Tori said wearily. The men returned to their SUV and pulled away with a spray of gravel. Jack watched until they disappeared around a corner before turning to Tori, questions evident in his expression. She sighed. Business competitors. The sustainable agriculture sector can be surprisingly cutthroat. Jack didn't believe that for a second, but he recognized the look of someone who didn't want to elaborate. He'd worn it often enough himself. Come on, he said, returning the tire iron to its place under the seat. Let's get you to that rental car place before your competitors circle back. The Mountain View rental agency proved to be exactly as limited as Jack had predicted. The middle-aged woman behind the counter apologized profusely to Tori. With the festival preparations, we're completely booked through next Wednesday. Everyone from 3 counties is converging on the fairgrounds. She glanced at Jack. Hey, Jack, heard about your barn. That's rough. Jack nodded in acknowledgement. Small towns had efficient information networks that no social media platform could rival. Is there a hotel where Mrs. Caldwell could stay until a car becomes available? He asked. More bad news followed. The town's 2 motels were fully booked, as were the bed and breakfasts in the surrounding area. The festival had created a perfect accommodation drought. Outside on the sidewalk, Tori looked genuinely at a loss, something Jack suspected didn't happen to her often. I could call a taxi to take you to Bozeman, he suggested reluctantly. It's about 90 minutes, but you'd find rentals and hotels there. Tori checked her watch, frowning. I have meetings scheduled here tomorrow morning. People coming in specifically to meet with me. She looked up at him, clearly weighing options. Is there anywhere closer where I might find a room for a few nights I can pay well? Jack rubbed the back of his neck, already regretting what he was about to offer. I have a guest cabin on my property. It's basic, but clean. You're welcome to use it until you sort things out. Surprise flickered across her face. That's very generous, but I couldn't impose. It's not generosity, Jack cut in. It's practicality. Those men knew where to find you, which means they're watching the roads. You shouldn't be alone in town. Tori studied him, reassessing. You think they're dangerous? I think men who carry concealed weapons and make vague threats usually are, Jack said bluntly. The cabin has a solid lock and is within shouting distance of the main house. You'll be safer there than anywhere in town. A complicated series of emotions crossed Tori's face before she nodded. Thank you. I accept. On one condition, you let me pay you a fair rate. Jack shrugged. We can discuss that later. I need to file a statement with the sheriff about the fire. You can come along or wait here. I'll come with you, she said quickly, glancing down the street. I'd rather not be alone right now. The sheriff's office occupied the ground floor of a brick building that also housed the post office and the town's small library. Inside, the air conditioning was working overtime against the summer heat, creating a welcome respite from the humidity outside. Sheriff Dave Mason looked up from his desk as they entered, surprise registering at the sight of Jack with a companion, especially one with a cut on her forehead in city clothes. Jack, he greeted, rising. And you must be the lady from the overturned vehicle. Deputy Collins radioed it in. He extended his hand to Tori. Sheriff Dave Mason. Victoria Caldwell, she replied, shaking his hand firmly. Your deputy was very helpful, but Mr. Morgan arrived first and assisted me. Mason raised an eyebrow at Jack, who rarely involved himself in others' problems. Good Samaritan now. Jack Will wonders never cease. Jack ignored the jab. Ms. Caldwell needs a statement form for her insurance, and I need to file one about the fire. As Tori filled out paperwork at a nearby desk, Jack quietly recounted to Mason the encounter with the men in the SUV. You think they followed her from somewhere else? Mason asked, keeping his voice low. Seems likely. They weren't local, that's for sure. Mason made a note. I'll run the plates if Deputy Collins got them. Where's she staying? My guest cabin. No rooms in town. Mason's eyebrows shot up. The famous Morgan hospitality extends to strangers. Now Ellen would be proud. The mention of his late wife sent a familiar pang through Jack's chest. Ellen would have invited her to stay in the main house and made her pie, he said gruffly. I'm just offering a cabin I don't use. Mason studied his old friend's face. Be careful, Jack. You don't know anything about this woman. I know she's in some kind of trouble, and I know leaving her to those men wouldn't sit right. Jack shifted uncomfortably. Besides, it's just for a few days. When they left the sheriff's office, Jack suggested they stop at the general store for provisions. Tori waited in the truck while he went inside, returning with groceries and basic toiletries. You didn't have to do that, Tori said as he loaded the bags into the bed. Cabins stocked with linens and kitchen basics, but not much else, Jack explained. Figured you might need some essentials. The drive back to the farm took them past fields in various states of health, some lush with corn or wheat, others showing the stress of the ongoing drought. Jack pointed out landmarks along the way, including the creek that was central to River West's water diversion plans. That water's been feeding these farms for generations, he explained, a hint of anger creeping into his voice. The diversion would leave us high and dry while sending the water to their massive operations 50 miles south. That doesn't sound legal, Tori observed. Jack's laugh was bitter. Money makes a lot of things legal. River West has been buying water rights from desperate farmers, one by one. They're close to having enough control to push through their project. And your farm has senior water rights dating back to 1936, but they expire when my bank loan comes due in 90 days, and refinancing isn't looking promising. Tori nodded thoughtfully, making another mental note. Jack was starting to wonder about her interest, but before he could question her further, they arrived at the Morgan farm. The property spread out before them, 400 acres nestled in a valley with mountains rising in the distance. The two-story farmhouse, built by Jack's grandfather in 1947, stood proudly despite its weathered white paint and sagging porch. Nearby, the partially damaged barn was already being patched by a small crew of neighbors. Beyond stretched fields of wheat, a small apple orchard, and pasture land where a modest herd of cattle grazed. Jack parked near the house and led Tori along a well-worn path to a small cabin about 200 yards from the main building. The structure was simple but solid, a one-room affair with a covered porch, built originally as a foreman's quarters back when the farm employed year-round help. It's not fancy, Jack said, unlocking the door. But it's private. Inside, the cabin was surprisingly charming. A queen-sized bed with a handmade quilt occupied one corner. A kitchenette with basic appliances lined one wall, while a small wood stove sat cold in the center. A door led to a compact bathroom with a shower stall. "This is perfect," Tori said, setting down her salvaged bag from the wreck. "Really, it's lovely." Jack felt an unexpected flush of pride. He'd maintained the cabin meticulously over the years, though it rarely saw use since Ellen's passing. The thought of his wife prompted him to gesture to a bookshelf filled with paperbacks. "My wife was a reader, kept this place stocked with books for when she wanted quiet time." Tori ran her fingers along the spines, an eclectic mix of classics, westerns, and mysteries. "She had good taste." "She did," Jack agreed quietly. He cleared his throat. "Bathroom has a first aid kit under the sink for that cut. I'll bring your groceries from the truck." When he returned with the bags, Tori had removed her mud-spattered jacket. As she reached up to help him with the groceries, Jack noticed something on her right forearm, a partially removed tattoo, still visible despite obvious laser treatments. He caught only a glimpse, but it looked like some kind of logo. "I'll leave you to settle in," Jack said, stepping back toward the door. "Main house is just up the path if you need anything. I'll be working on the barn most of the afternoon." Tori nodded gratefully. "Thank you, Jack, for everything." As he walked back to the house, Jack found himself wondering what a polished consultant like Victoria Caldwell was really doing in Oak Ridge, Montana, and who wanted to find her badly enough to send armed men looking. By evening, Jack had helped patch enough of the barn to secure it against the elements, though proper repairs would take weeks. His body ached from the physical labor after the sleepless night, reminding him that 58 wasn't 38, no matter how much his mind might insist otherwise. He was washing up at the kitchen sink when he noticed Tori walking toward the barn, now wearing clean jeans and a fresh button-down shirt, her hair pulled back. She moved with purpose, examining the structure as one might inspect a potential investment. Jack dried his hands and went outside to meet her. "Settling in okay?" "Yes, thank you." She turned toward the barn. "Your neighbors did good work. Rural communities still believe in barn raising," Jack explained. "We help each other or we don't survive." Tori nodded thoughtfully. "I was raised to believe the same, though in a different context." She gestured toward the damaged section. "What's your estimate on full repairs?" Jack was surprised by the direct question. "About 20,000, if I do most of the work myself." "Why professional curiosity?" she replied. "Sustainable agriculture includes sustainable economics. Your farm represents exactly the kind of operation my project is designed to support." Jack studied her face, looking for signs of the condescension he often detected in outsiders who thought they understood farming from academic studies. He found none. "What exactly is this project of yours?" he asked. "A public-private partnership," Tori explained, choosing her words carefully. "Developing financial and operational models to help family farms remain competitive against corporate agriculture." "Sounds like swimming against the current," Jack observed. "Corporate farms have been swallowing operations like mine for decades." "That doesn't make it inevitable," Tori countered. "There's growing support for local food systems, for environmental stewardship, for preserving agricultural heritage. The financial models just haven't caught up to the cultural shift." Jack almost smiled at her intensity. "You actually believe that?" "I wouldn't be here if I didn't," she said simply. Before Jack could respond, his phone rang. He answered to find Thomas on the line, his voice tense. "Dad, I've been looking into River West," his son said without preamble. "They filed for expedited review of their water project permits yesterday morning before your fire." Jack's jaw tightened. "They knew something we didn't." "There's more. Their parent company just announced a major acquisition in the electric vehicle battery sector. They're positioning for mineral rights, not just water." "Mineral rights," Jack repeated, glancing at Tori, who was pretending not to listen. "What minerals?" "Lithium, Possibly. The geological surveys are sealed, but the timing is suspicious. I've got a colleague looking into it further. After ending the call, Jack found Tori watching him with undisguised interest. Trouble? She asked. Jack hesitated, then decided there was little harm in sharing public information. River West may be after more than water rights. Thomas, my son, thinks there might be valuable minerals under these farms. Something flickered in Tori's eyes, recognition, perhaps, or confirmation of a suspicion. That would explain their aggressive tactics, she said. Mineral extraction is far more profitable than agriculture. Jack nodded grimly. And far more damaging to the land. If they strip mine this valley, it'll never recover. They stood in silence for a moment, watching the sun begin its descent behind the mountains, painting the fields in gold and amber. Despite his exhaustion and the problems pressing in from all sides, Jack felt a moment of peace, standing on land his family had worked for generations. Beautiful, Tori murmured, seemingly sharing his appreciation. Worth fighting for. Jack agreed. Their moment of shared contemplation was interrupted by the distant sound of an engine. Jack tensed, automatically positioning himself slightly in front of Tori as a vehicle approached up the long driveway. Relief washed over him as he recognized Ben Henderson's old pickup. The farmer from the neighboring property pulled up and rolled down his window. Evening, Jack. Ma sent dinner. He handed over a covered casserole dish, then noticed Tori. Oh, sorry, didn't realize you had company. Ben, this is Victoria Caldwell. She's consulting on an agricultural project and staying in the cabin for a few days. Ms. Caldwell. Ben Henderson. His family farms the property to the east. Ben tipped his hat. Ma sent plenty. You're welcome to join the Morgans for dinner. Ms. Caldwell. It's just me these days. Ben, Jack corrected. But thank your mother for me. After Ben departed, Jack turned to Tori. Dinner at the house. Martha Henderson's casseroles are legendary in 3 counties. Tori smiled, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her. How could I refuse such an endorsement? The farmhouse kitchen was the heart of the Morgan home, just as it had been when Jack's mother cooked there, and later Ellen. The oak table could seat 8 comfortably, though it had been years since that many people had gathered around it. Tonight, Jack set 2 places at one end. This house has history, Tori observed, looking at the photographs lining the walls, 4 generations of Morgans standing proudly on the same land. Too much, sometimes, Jack admitted, serving the casserole a hearty combination of chicken, wild rice, and vegetables. Makes it hard to consider change when every decision feels like you're answering to ghosts. Tori accepted a plate gratefully. That's the paradox of legacy, isn't it, honoring the past while adapting to the future? You sound like you've given it some thought. My family business is in its 3rd generation, she explained, her expression carefully neutral. The tension between tradition and innovation is familiar. Jack nodded, curious but unwilling to pry further. They ate in companionable silence for a few minutes, the food providing a welcome comfort after the long day. Your truck, Tori said eventually, changing the subject. It's impressive that you've kept it running so long. Most people would have replaced it years ago. Jack smiled slightly. That truck's outlasted 2 marriages and carried my son home from the hospital. It's part of the family. You maintain it yourself. Most things, engine rebuild last year nearly broke me, but it was still cheaper than a new truck with a loan payment. Tori leaned forward, genuinely interested. What's the secret to its longevity? Regular maintenance, quality parts when they're needed, not when it's convenient. Knowing how to listen to it, engines talk to you if you pay attention. Jack shrugged. And maybe some stubbornness. They don't build them like that anymore. No, Tori agreed softly. They don't. The conversation shifted to the farm, its history, its operations, the challenges of modern agriculture. Jack found himself explaining crop rotation practices and cattle management to a surprisingly knowledgeable audience. Tori asked intelligent questions about water usage, soil health, and equipment efficiency. For a consultant, you know a lot about the practical side of farming, Jack observed as they cleared the dishes. Tori smiled enigmatically. I believe in understanding the reality on the ground, not just the theory. Later, as Jack walked her back to the cabin in the gathering darkness, they paused to admire the vast canopy of stars visible only in places far from city lights. I'd forgotten how clear they are out here, Tori murmured, looking up. You grew up rural? Jack asked, surprised. She hesitated. No, but I spent summers on my grandfather's property in Vermont. He had a workshop where he taught me about engines and mechanics. It was the happiest time of my childhood. There was a vulnerability in her voice that Jack hadn't heard before, a glimpse behind the composed exterior she maintained. Before he could respond, she turned to face him directly. Jack, I want to thank you properly for your hospitality. Would you allow me to help with the barn repairs tomorrow? I'm more capable with tools than I might appear. The offer caught him off guard. That's not necessary. Please, or she interrupted. I'd like to be useful. And honestly, I'm curious about the structural elements of these old barns. It's relevant to my research. Jack considered her request. Having an extra pair of hands would be helpful, and something told him Tori Caldwell wasn't the type to make offers she couldn't fulfill. All right, he agreed. We start at 7. Her smile was unexpectedly warm. I'll be ready. As Jack walked back to the empty farmhouse, he found himself intrigued by his mysterious guest, a woman who recognized truck models at a glance, asked insightful questions about agriculture, and was willing to get her hands dirty with barn repairs. Victoria Caldwell was clearly not the typical consultant, and Jack was beginning to suspect there was much more to her story than she was sharing. True to her word, Tori appeared at the main house at precisely 7 the next morning, dressed in work jeans, boots, and a flannel shirt that looked brand new but practical. Her hair was pulled back in a ponytail, and she carried a thermos. I made coffee, she explained, offering it to Jack. I wasn't sure if you'd have time before starting work. Jack accepted the thermos with surprise and appreciation. The coffee was strong and black, exactly how he preferred it. Thanks. Ready to get dirty. The day's work involved replacing damaged support beams and reinforcing the barn's western wall. Jack had expected to spend most of his time explaining basic tasks to Tori, but she quickly proved him wrong. She handled power tools with confidence, read structural plans with ease, and even suggested an improvement to his bracing technique that Jack had to admit was superior to his original plan. By mid-morning, they had fallen into an efficient rhythm, working side by side with minimal conversation needed. Jack found himself impressed not just by Tori's unexpected skills, but by her work ethic. She attacked each task with the same intensity he imagined she brought to corporate boardrooms. Where did you learn construction? He finally asked as they paused for water. Tori wiped sweat from her brow, leaving a smudge of dirt across her forehead. My grandfather believed in practical education. Theory without application is just hot air, he used to say. Smart man. He was, she agreed, a hint of sadness crossing her features. He built something meaningful, something that lasted. I've been trying to honor that legacy. Before Jack could ask for clarification, his phone rang. The caller ID showed the Farmers Bank of Oak Ridge, specifically Howard Tate, the loan officer handling his increasingly precarious refinancing application. Jack stepped away to take the call, his expression darkening as the conversation progressed. When he returned, Tori could clearly read the bad news in his face. Problem? She asked. Nothing unexpected, Jack replied, his voice carefully neutral. Bank's getting pressure from somewhere. They've moved up the timeline on my loan assessment. Tori frowned. That's unusual. It is when the pressure is coming from a corporation with no official connection to my loan, Jack said grimly. River West is calling in favors, making sure I don't find a way out of this corner. He turned back to the barn, attacking the next beam with barely contained frustration. Tori worked alongside him in silence for several minutes before speaking again. Jack, I might be able to help. My organization has connections with agricultural lending institutions that specialize in sustainable farm transitions. Jack paused, hammer mid-swing. What kind of terms? Better than you're getting from a local bank being pressured by corporate interests? Tori said confidently. But I'd need to see your financial statements, water rights documentation, and property surveys. Jack lowered the hammer, studying her carefully. That's a lot of personal information to share with someone I met yesterday. Tori met his gaze steadily. I understand your hesitation, but this is what I do. Jack, I connect struggling family farms with resources they wouldn't find on their own. She hesitated, then added, You don't have to decide now. Think about it. They returned to work, the rhythm between them slightly altered by the conversation. Jack found himself weighing Tori's offer against his dwindling options. Pride had prevented him from seeking outside help for years, but with the farm's future hanging in the balance, could he afford to reject a potential lifeline? Around noon, a dust cloud on the driveway announced the arrival of another vehicle, this one, a sleek black sedan that looked distinctly out of place on the rural property. Jack tensed, reaching instinctively for a nearby pry bar. The car stopped near the barn, and a man in an expensive suit emerged, tall and distinguished, with silver hair and the confident bearing of someone accustomed to authority. He surveyed the property with calculating eyes before approaching. Mr. Morgan, he called. Warren Phillips, River West Agribusiness. I believe we spoke on the phone last month. Jack's expression hardened. I remember. I also remember telling you I wasn't interested in selling. Phillips smiled thinly. Circumstances change. I understood there was some trouble here last night, a fire. Most unfortunate. The implied threat wasn't lost on Jack. He stepped forward, positioning himself protectively between Phillips and Tori without conscious thought. If you're here to make another lowball offer, you're wasting your time, Jack stated flatly. Phillips's gaze shifted to Tori, who had moved to stand beside Jack, her expression carefully neutral. I don't believe we've met. Warren Phillips, he extended his hand. Victoria Caldwell, Tori replied, not taking the offered hand. I'm consulting with Mr. Morgan on sustainable agricultural practices. Something flickered in Phillips's eyes, recognition, perhaps, or calculation. Caldwell, any relation to the automotive family? It's a common name, Tori replied smoothly. Phillips studied her for a moment longer before turning back to Jack. Mr. Morgan, I'm authorized to increase our offer by 15% in light of your recent difficulties. That's considerably above market value for agricultural land in this county. This land isn't for sale, Jack stated firmly. Not to River West, not to anyone. Phillips sighed dramatically. I admire your commitment, Mr. Morgan, but sentiment won't pay your bank loan, and once the property is in foreclosure, River West will acquire it anyway, likely for much less than we're offering now. Jack felt his temper rising, but kept his voice level. Is that why you're pressuring the bank to accelerate my loan assessment, creating a crisis you can exploit? Business is business, Phillips replied with a shrug. River West has a responsibility to its shareholders to acquire assets at the most advantageous terms. Even if that means manufacturing those terms through intimidation and possibly arson. Tori interjected, her voice sharp. Phillips's smile vanished. That's a serious accusation. Ms. Caldwell, I'd be careful about making statements that could be considered defamatory. Honey and I'd be careful about threatening witnesses in a case already under investigation by the county sheriff, she countered. The corporate executive's expression hardened as he turned back to Jack. My offer stands for 48 hours. Mr. Morgan, after that, we'll proceed with our plans and let the market take its course. He handed Jack a business card. When you're ready to be reasonable, call me. As Phillips drove away, Jack turned to Tori with newfound respect and curiosity. You handled him like you've dealt with his type before. I have, she admitted, more often than I'd like. Jack studied her face, seeing determination there, but also something else, a personal stake in this conflict that went beyond professional interest. Why do you care about my farm? Tori, really? She hesitated, seeming to weigh how much to reveal. Because what's happening here is happening across the country. Corporate interests manipulating markets, forcing out family operations, consolidating control over resources. She met his gaze directly. And because sometimes you have to draw a line and say, no more, Jack recognized the conviction in her voice. It mirrored his own stubborn refusal to surrender his heritage without a fight. Whatever Tori's full story might be, they were aligned in this battle. About those financial documents, he said finally. They're in my office. After dinner, I'll show you what you need to see. That evening, they spread documents across Jack's desk in what had once been a formal dining room. Farm ledgers, water rights certificates, loan documents, and property surveys created a paper trail of the Morgan family's agricultural history. Tori examined each document with meticulous attention, occasionally asking clarifying questions that revealed her expertise in both finance and agriculture. Jack watched her work, impressed by her thoroughness and apparent understanding of complex water rights issues. This is interesting, she said eventually, holding up a yellowed document from a folder of his father's papers. According to this, your water rights are tied to a covenant that predates Montana statehood. It references the original territorial agreements? Jack nodded. Dad always said our water claim went back to the territory days, but I've never had reason to trace it that far. This could be significant, Tori explained, excitement creeping into her voice. Pre-statehood water rights are adjudicated differently than modern claims. They may be exempt from the abandonment clause River West is trying to trigger through your loan default. Hope flickered briefly in Jack's chest, but caution tempered it. The bank's lawyers would have found that if it mattered. Not necessarily, Tori countered. Banking attorneys specialize in financial law, not water rights dating back to territorial days. This is specialized knowledge. She looked up at him, determination in her eyes. May I take photos of these documents? I'd like to consult with some experts in my network. Jack hesitated only briefly before nodding. Do whatever you need to. At this point, I've got nothing to lose. As Tori carefully photographed the documents, Jack poured 2 glasses of whiskey from a bottle he reserved for rare celebrations or particularly difficult days. He handed one to Tori, who accepted with a nod of thanks. To unexpected allies, he offered, raising his glass. And hidden resources, she added, touching her glass to his. The whiskey burned pleasantly going down, its warmth spreading through Jack's tired body. He leaned back in his chair, studying Tori's face in the soft lamplight. For all her competence and composure, there was a weariness around her eyes that suggested she was fighting battles of her own. You never said what happened with those men who confronted us yesterday, Jack ventured. The ones who clearly weren't business competitors? Tori sighed, setting down her glass. It's complicated. Most things worth talking about are. She smiled faintly at that. True enough. She was quiet for a moment, organizing her thoughts. I was engaged to a man named Anton Kozlov. He runs a multinational conglomerate with interests in everything from real estate to technology. The engagement ended when I discovered he was using our relationship to access proprietary information from my family's company. Industrial espionage, Jack translated. Among other things, Tori confirmed. I exposed his activities to my company's board and terminated the engagement. Anton doesn't handle rejection well, especially when it comes with professional consequences. So he sends men to track you down and what bring you back, threaten you? Probably both, Tori admitted. He's used to getting what he wants, one way or another. Jack frowned, the protective instinct that had served him well in the military rising again. And you're traveling alone, without security. I didn't expect him to find me here, Tori explained. I've been careful about my movements. Someone must have talked. She straightened. visibly pushing aside her concerns. But that's my problem, not yours. Let's focus on these water rights. Jack wanted to press further but recognized the deflection for what it was. Everyone had secrets they guarded, he certainly did. Instead, he refilled their glasses and steered the conversation back to the farm's financial situation. They worked late into the night, creating a comprehensive picture of the Morgan Farm's assets, liabilities, and potential. By the time Tori returned to her cabin, they had the outline of a strategy that might provide a path forward that didn't involve surrendering to River West. Jack remained at his desk after she left, reviewing the notes they'd made. Despite the dire circumstances, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years: hope. Not blind optimism, but the grounded hope that comes from having a plan and a capable ally. What he couldn't quite determine was why Victoria Caldwell had chosen to be that ally. Her explanation about sustainable agriculture made sense on the surface, but Jack sensed deeper motivations she hadn't yet revealed. The partially removed tattoo, her mechanical knowledge, her familiarity with corporate tactics, pieces of a puzzle he couldn't quite assemble. As he finally prepared for bed, Jack found himself hoping she would eventually trust him enough to share the full truth. Because one thing had become clear during their day: working side by side, Tori Caldwell was fighting for something personal, something that mattered to her beyond professional interest or abstract principles. Just as he was about to turn out the lights, Jack's phone chimed with a text message from an unknown number. Morgan Farm records accessed today by third party. Security alert triggered. Confirm authorization. Oak Ridge County Records Office. Jack stared at the message in confusion. The county records office didn't send text alerts, and certainly not at nearly midnight. This was either a phishing attempt or something more sinister. He deleted the message without responding, but the implication was clear: someone was monitoring his actions, perhaps even his conversations with Tori. The game was bigger than he had realized, and the stakes were clearly high enough to warrant sophisticated surveillance. Jack Morgan had never backed down from a fight in his life, but as he finally drifted towards sleep, he wondered exactly what kind of battle he had stumbled into, and whether Victoria Caldwell was truly the ally she appeared to be. The autumn light spilled across fields that had weathered another season, fields that remained in Morgan hands, despite the corporate wolves that had circled them. The rebuilt barn stood stronger than before, its new timber blending with the old, much like the partnership that had saved it. Jack's weathered F-150 sat parked beside Tori's sleek company sedan, an unlikely pairing that somehow made perfect sense now. Two people from worlds that rarely intersected had found common ground in the defense of something authentic, something worth preserving. Not everything had been salvaged. Of course, the drought had taken its toll on the eastern acreage. River West's failed takeover had left scars on the community, and trust, once broken, had needed careful mending between father and son, between a woman and her family legacy, between neighbors who'd forgotten what it meant to stand together. The Legacy Series trucks, now rolling off Caldwell Motors production lines, carried something of this valley in their DNA: the stubborn refusal to be disposable, the commitment to endure beyond convenience or fashion. But perhaps the real legacy wasn't in the machines at all, but in the choice to fight for something permanent in a world obsessed with the temporary. What remains, after all, when the battles end and the dust settles? But the things we've built to last.